Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
President Biden's $1.9 trillion, yes, trillion with a T, $1.9 trillion stimulus plan has been unveiled. At least we've gotten some details. And the two big highlights that have stuck out to us that we want to talk about with you today are the $1,400 checks designed to top off the $600 checks that have and are being delivered to Americans right now. And then also the plan to raise the minimum wage. Yes, raising the minimum wage is part of that stimulus plan from $7.25, the federal minimum wage, up to $15 an hour. So there's a lot to unpack with those two. And if there's still time, we'll talk about some of the other key points of President Biden's stimulus plan. But there's a lot to break down here to decide if these are really good things or not for the economy. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on American politics without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, folks, this is going to be a good one. I think we're going to start to see what the Biden administration wants to do to help the economy and to get the nation through the pandemic. So we're going to see a change in leadership, and that change in leadership will be a change in the way the pandemic is attacked and the way the economy is attacked. And that's going to make it interesting because there are going to be people that support it and there are going to be people that are against it. So at least now, hopefully you'll have some basic information to listen to both sides as we begin to discuss what the new administration's plan is to do to get us through the rest of the pandemic.
And I think the important message too, Lance, is it's okay, right, if our listeners come down with a mixed bag, that they like some of what's being proposed, but not all of it, because my guess is here, we'll see how our conversation develops today, but you might find that out from Lance and I, that some of this is things that we feel pretty strongly about one way or the other, but that's kind of the point of the show, and we want you to engage. So as you're listening along, if something strikes you, either you've got a comment or it stirs up a question, we want you to send us an email. We want to hear from you. Send it to podcast@thestateofus.org. podcast@thestateofus.org. Send us your thoughts. We like hearing from you all at home.
Keep this in mind, folks. Here's the word of the day. The word of the day is stimulus. STIMULUS. And here's the definition. So keep this definition in mind as we're talking today. Something that rouses or incites to action or increased action, an incentive. So that's the basis for calling this. It's obviously an economic stimulus, but that's what it is. It's to rouse to action as an incentive. Okay.
That's what they're hoping to accomplish.
That's right. That's what the plan is. By definition of the word stimulus, that's what they're hoping to do.
That's what they
It's
think
not
they're
to
going
fix
to
all
do.
the problems. It's not to put, money in everybody's pocket and all of a sudden everybody go out and buy a new car or put improvements into your house or pay for your students' college, or that's not what a stimulus is supposed to do. So keep that in mind as we're talking about these issues. And if we get time, maybe a few more.
So basically here we're looking at these $1,400 checks that are designed, Lance, right, to be the round out of the $600 checks that some people are receiving or have already received, that started to be sent out late December, early January. So the thinking here is this is, a grand total of a $2,000 direct payment. And this is where we get into that. Is it really good for the economy? But just to be clear, before we go into that, there is income thresholds on this. So you're not going to be a member of the ultra wealthy and likely get one of these checks. You're going to have to be in those more standard tax brackets here in the United States. But the Wall Street Journal put out, I think, Lance, an interesting opinion piece. Opinion, folks, can't stress that enough these days. Doesn't mean the Wall Street Journal is biased. It just means they have an opinion page. And on the opinion page, the title is "Those 2,000 Checks Won't Boost the Economy." And of course, they bring in some facts like you would expect if you're trying to make a good argument. And here's what we know, Lance. Since the mid-1970s, one-time cash payments to individuals to stimulate economic growth have been tried on at least 5 separate occasions. Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter both promised their stimulus checks would restore economic growth by inducing higher consumption. Yet in both instances, the payments failed to deliver the promised results. Their impact on economic output at best was negligible and only temporary. George W. Bush, Barack Obama were similar flops. The failures are consistent with permanent income and life cycle theories of individual consumption behavior. Both theories suggest that individuals' consumption is determined primarily by their income over time. Hence, a one-time cash assistance grant does not boost consumption. Although data is still coming in on the effects of the one-time cash payments authorized by the March CARES Act, Trump's direct payments, so far the pattern is the same. Using a large-scale survey, most respondents report that they primarily saved or paid down debts with their stimulus checks, with only about 15% of people reporting that they spent most of it, on something new. That's kind of the base of it, Lance, right? Is this idea that if you just send somebody a one-time check, it's not likely to probably do a lot of stimulating. They're probably going to pay down debt or just stuff it into savings. Now, if you were sending them checks like some of those universal basic income people would like on a regular basis, that might be different. But since people don't know when or if they're going to get these checks, is it really worth doing?
Okay, so it doesn't, quote, stimulate the economy in that there's actually more spending. Well, that's almost logical because it's only a one-time thing. So there's not a whole lot you can do with it, right? It's like in the old days when companies, to avoid paying federal taxes, used to give Christmas bonuses. It really didn't stimulate the economy. Right. They didn't do that to make, they did it to make their workers feel good, and they did it to avoid paying federal tax.
Sure. Earn some brownie points, right? Because
the federal tax rate was so high. Well, now companies don't do that anymore, not because the economy isn't good, but because we've lowered the tax rate on corporations to where it's now conducive for them to keep their own money, not to give it away to the government in a higher tax rate. I think we're looking at it in the wrong way. I won't argue with the article, but what I would say these stimulus checks do is make people feel a little bit better about themselves and their situation, which I think is something that we need right now. So I think if we're looking at it to see a V-shaped, as we hear the economists talk, a V-shaped jump in the economy from this, no, that's not going to happen. But I think it makes people feel better in the dark days of winter to hold out hope that things will get better soon, that springtime will blossom and we'll all be around, or more of us will be around, and things will get better. We need to look at these stimulus checks that's our goal, not to bring back the economy, but to help people see that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And please continue to fight the pandemic and do the things we know we need to do. In the immortal words of the song, the sun will come up tomorrow. I think that's what we need to look at these stimulus checks as.
Well, if we're talking about what it really comes down to, right, is it's good politics. I mean, and this is not just strictly a criticism, by the way, of Democrats either, because to point out, remember, George W. Bush has done this. President Trump signed this into law. President Trump went so far in December of 2020 to suggest they needed to be $2,000 checks. So the notion that this is a strictly Democrat or Republican idea is false. The reason they do it, I think, to Lance's point, we can't be 100% sure they'll justify it as a stimulus payment, but in reality, who doesn't like to get a check, right? It's kind of like that Christmas bonus thing. At the end of the day, did it make a big difference to your overall earning? Probably not. Did you really stimulate the economy with it? Because one of the questions I've heard a lot, Lance, is, well, why does everybody in that income threshold get it as opposed to just people that are out of work or making less money because of the pandemic? And the answer is because when they justify it as a stimulus check, the goal is if I send Lance, right, $2,000. The hope is that Lance says, oh my gosh, that's $2,000 I didn't have. I'm going to go buy something. But Lance, being who Lance is, and like many Americans, they get that money and say, okay, what can I pay down with this? Right? How can I make my financial situation for the long term better with this $2,000? So it's not to say that there aren't benefits to doing it, but let's be really clear about what it's touted as and what it does are not the same things.
Personally, though, with these last two rounds of, and this is personal, I agree with you that typically that's what happens. But these last two rounds of stimulus checks, I've actually put it in the hands of contractors.
Okay.
I had things that I had been holding off doing around the house, and I've been able then to feel more comfortable that I can spend that money because it was money I wasn't counting on. So it was things I would have done anyway, but I could do them sooner. And it did help a couple of contractors make their way through the pandemic. So in my situation, personally, I did use it to stimulate the economy and help a couple of local businesses.
Well, and see, on my front, I can tell you that when Brett and I have received the checks, and we got the $600 checks came in for us. I don't know if they have for you yet or not, Lance.
I think they have, according to
the boss.
The federal government site.
Okay.
They came in.
Okay.
I haven't checked the funds in the bank, but I did get online and
been notified.
Okay.
Yes. Been informed. So yeah, in our situation, I can tell you, one time they went to pay down debt. The other time they went into savings, and I guess, they went into savings this time. That would be this most recent time. I think that's the mixed bag. And that's where I guess I look at this and say, I think when we're talking about spending this much money, if we're going to spend this much money, I don't see anything in here about infrastructure. And I'd almost be more tempted to, take this money and say, let's look at these checks for the people that, have been adversely affected by the pandemic. For the people like Lance and I, let's not send them these checks. And instead, let's see if there's a different priority out there that maybe makes more sense for us to take on. Because again, it's a lot of money and we're sending that deficit skyrocketing here. And if it's truly not the most effective thing for the economy, then it shouldn't be what we're spending money on.
You don't think there's any value to raising people's spirits?
I do. I don't think that it's more valuable than, say, investing in our crumbling infrastructure and creating real jobs as a result of it. I guess would be my thinking. I think it's absolutely valuable. And I'm sure I know we could put a dollar number on it. If we did the research and found the psychological studies, we know people are more productive. I just think that, again, when we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, we kind of did all this, and you and I talked about that. It felt like without a lot of fiscal responsibility. And I guess that's my concern here, is that we kind of just keep plowing forward on it. And this is not the Biden administration specifically. Yes, they're going to do it too, but Trump, the Republicans, and the Democrats in 2020, they all did it. And we didn't hear, a peep about any of that.
I guess just quickly, a historical perspective. We weren't worried about the fiscal cost when we were fighting World War II. It was something we had to get done, and we just spent the money, and then we dealt with the economic fallout afterwards. And the economy grew to the point where we more than paid for the money that we spent to fight World War II. And we currently have more people dying than we did in World War II and other wars combined. So is now the time to take up the argument that it's not being fiscally responsible when we have all of the things occurring in people's lives right now? Is now the time to worry about the deficit? I mean, we had plenty of time to worry about it before and didn't. Is now the time to worry about it?
It's a great question. It's one that I will answer when we come back. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
$1.9 trillion. It's a lot of money, no matter how you slice it. But Lance left us with a question about, is this the time to be concerned with fiscal responsibility? And I guess the thinking there is, I do not disagree, okay, we'll put it this way, that we need to spend $1.9 trillion. Do I agree with exactly the way that we want to spend it? Not necessarily. Because I think, again, if we're going to spend that type of money, what are the most effective ways to spend it? And that's kind of the next thing that we're talking about, one that I'm a lot more excited about than the $1,400, the $1,400 stimulus checks, and that's the minimum wage. This is something Lance and I feel like we've been on it now, Lance, for, 3 years or something, that we have to.
Maybe 5.
Yes.
I mean, we've been on it a long time. way back in the olden days of the show.
Yes.
When it had a different name, we were talking about the minimum wage.
Well, I think it became pretty straightforward for us, right? Because, and this is, you're listening out there, you're Democrat, Republican, whatever, just say that you're opposed to raising the minimum wage, okay? Because you've been told whatever you've been told. I think it comes down to just this, Lance, just the numbers, right? Let's set the partisan politics aside for just a second here and get this. Despite the fact that 2/3 of Americans support raising the federal minimum wage, yes, 66% of Americans support raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. It has been stuck at $7.25 an hour since July of 2009. That's the last time it was increased. Since that time, that $7.25 an hour has lost 14.8% of its purchasing power to inflation and 28% less than it was at its peak in terms of purchasing power in 1968. In other words, if we look at it this way, the federal minimum wage, if it had kept pace with workers' productivity since 1968, so we're going back to those good old days, Lance, when America was America, right? If we had kept pace, if we had stuck the minimum wage against inflation, it would be $24 an hour today.
Right.
Okay. That's minimum wage.
That's minimum wage. And we all know that everybody else's wage typically, historically, has been set off the minimum wage. We don't all make the minimum wage. So professional people's pay would go up as well. So this is the way that you spread the wealth, is that you pay the workers. And then if the minimum workers get this amount, well, then if you have a college education or you have a 2-year degree or you have a technical skill, then you're worth more than the minimum. And before people would say, well, but now you're worried about this group or losing jobs or whatever, you're talking then though about purchasing power. That's the key phrase here. What does it do any good for me to have a job if I can't go out and buy anything? If I can't go out and pay my bills, does it do any good for me to actually work? If I'm working, shouldn't I have the money to pay my bills and then go buy something? And isn't that the real stimulus to the economy? Is for me to have money to buy things when I get done working my job? And currently, people don't have that. The article goes on to talk about how, according to the Congressional Budget Office, this getting the minimum wage up to $15 an hour, we're not even talking 24, but up to $15 an hour by 2025 would raise the wages of 27.3 million workers in the United States and lift 1.3 million families out of poverty. And that's from the Congressional Budget Office. That's not some organization. That's not some left-wing group, radical group, or anything like that. That's from the federal government. The Congressional Budget Office says that it will lift over 1 million families out of poverty if we get it done by 2025, which is 4.5 years away. And it hasn't been raised in 12 years. Sorry, a little excited there. This is just so basic to me. It's basic understanding. It's not politics at all. It has nothing to do, like you said, you hinted at it. If you want to make America, back when a time when it was great to be an American, back to the 60s, which I lived that. I'm not sure we really want to go back there. I'm kind of living it now. So if you don't like now, I'm not sure you would have really loved the late 60s. But as a worker, you had the most buying power you ever had if you were making minimum wage. And you really don't have that now. My daughter, your husband, neither one are making $24 an hour, and they both have degrees and multiple degrees.
Yep. And I did this, Lance, while you were speaking, because I was thinking basic arithmetic here, right? $15 an hour. Because we talk about it a lot of times, and I think it sounds like a lot for people, but let's put this in perspective, right? Of those of us that don't work on an hourly wage, but work on a salary. Okay. What's $15 an hour? Well, $15 an hour times 40 hours a week times 50 weeks a year, that's $30,000, right. Lance. We're not talking about, right? I mean, this is not like you're going to be living high on the hog here if you're making $15 an hour.
Right. You're not going to start buying shares of Bitcoin, off of with your wages. So, but how much more purchasing power do you have? Because that means right now, if minimum wage is $7.25, you're making less than $15,000 a year, because $7.25 is more than 50% less than $15 an hour. So, I mean, somebody who's working a minimum wage job now at $7.25 an hour times 40 times 50 weeks is making about $14,400 or something like that. And I'm doing the math in my head. So don't, if you're going to email us at the podcast, don't, check my math there. That was just in my head. But really? I mean, so you're only making $14,000 a year now. And so going to 15 makes 30,000. And that's still if the plan, and we don't know how long the Biden plan has not told us how long it's going to take to go from 7.25 to 15. People are just, the Congressional Budget Office just said, if it's in 2025, those were the numbers that would happen.
Right. And here's the big caveat I want to mention, because everybody's listening and they're saying, okay, it sounds like Justin and Lance are just 100% for this. No questions asked. No, I want more details. And here's why. Because here's the big thing Lance and I have talked about. This is only a Band-Aid if we don't permanently adjust the way that we handle the minimum wage. Okay? Because frankly, I don't think there's a lot of places in the United States where you can make the case that if you were making $30,000 a year, you'd be in, the top 10% or something. Not really. The 30,000, we're not talking about crazy money here. We're talking about truly, I think what we would most feel like if you're out there and you're making 60,000 a year and we said, would you be okay if we cut your salary in half? Do you think you'd still really enjoy life as much as you do? I think most of those people out there making 60,000 would probably say no, that they wouldn't like that. So I think the important thing there to understand is we're talking about what the minimum should be, right? But Lance and I have talked about before, the way that you really solve this long term is put in place a regionally adjusted federal minimum wage. That is, states and localities are welcome to set it at a different rate. I have no objection to that. But to say this is the bare minimum, right? This is the cost of housing, of essential food in your area, right? The basic necessities of life. This is the minimum threshold. And that way, Lance, people in Champaign County, right? Urbana, Ohio, where you and I are not going to be set at $30 an hour, while people in LA might be set at $35 an hour. The point is, it costs different money to live well in different places. And the notion that a single, wage should be set and that's what we should all abide by, as we've talked about before, can hurt the economy because it actually can repress if you raise it too much, those places that are already repressed, like our rural area. Now, 15, I think, is okay. I think that as we've established, that's okay. But if you were talking about $30 an hour, for example, now you're getting into that territory where you're going to do the opposite of what you want to do. And that's why we've talked about, if you switch to this graduated system, it actually incentivizes companies to invest in places where the cost of living is lower, thereby raising the standard of living for everybody. So I guess that would be my one big caveat to this, is I would love to see that as part of the plan, because then I could be all for this. No holding back. I'm glad that it's part of the conversation again. I just think, again, there's a more holistic approach that we ought to be taking if we're going to have that discussion.
Sure. But this just gets us, this is a Band-Aid, but maybe it gives us throughout the next 4 years to have that discussion for what you and I have proposed as a regional minimum wage, is the way I refer to it. Because let's face it, the $15 an hour, that's already widely across the United States. I mean, there are many localities and states that have already set the minimum wage at $15. We're just talking about the federal minimum wage. So there are many
lots
of
our
employers
too, right?
And there are many employers to get qualified workers who have already raised their wage to that. So this doesn't affect too many people, but I'm all for the Band-Aid, and because then maybe it gives us time to have the further discussion that you're looking for. So I'll take the Band-Aid and hope that it leads to the further discussions, because as you said, getting it to $15 an hour in the next 4 years doesn't help a lot of people. It helps many people, but there are a lot of people in our country that it won't help. And even at that, I don't mean to argue with you too much semantically, but I'll take umbrage at your word of people could live well. People aren't going to live well on minimum wage. Minimum wage isn't designed to have somebody live well. My take is it's to help them live. And we have too many people who are struggling to stay alive. They're deciding whether they can eat or heat their apartments, heat their living space, whether they can stay inside during the wintertime or whether they can feed their children. And that should not be the case in America if you're working. Okay. Notice what I'm saying. If you're working. I mean, we can have a discussion another time about unemployment, and that's addressed here in the Biden package, but people who are chronically unemployed and your welfare system and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not saying I'm for or against it. We can discuss that some other time. But if I'm working full time, I should be able to pay for a place to live and heat it and live in a comfort temperature, either in the heat or, no dangerous things in heat or cold, and be able to feed my family 3 square meals a day. That I should be able to do that if I'm working a full-time job. That's my argument.
Supposedly that's part of the dream that we sell people, right? Or the promise.
Well, that's a minimum wage. I may not be living well. I may not be able to invest in the stock market. I may not be able to pay for my kids to go to college. Okay. But I should be able to provide the basic necessities of life for myself and my family with a minimum wage. To me, that's what that means.
The other change I'd like to see, this is a simple one, in the package, let's quit calling it the minimum wage. Let's call it a living wage, right? In other words, what's it take to live? Because minimum wage doesn't.
Living wage.
Yeah. Minimum wage basically means nothing, right? It's just what we're saying is whatever we feel like the minimum ought to be. And yes, I know it seems like a semantic change, but I think it's an important change to, as Lance pointed out, speaking to what are we as a country referring to when we talk about our minimum wage? Well, right now we're referring to an arbitrary number that really has no meaning or value, because I have not found an employer, Lance, in the past 5 years that's paying true federal minimum wage. And one of the reasons is because most states have taken it upon themselves to force it higher than that, because they're like, look, it's not realistic for that to be the case for most of our people.
Or the companies themselves have to raise it because they can't compete for workers. They can't find anybody to take their job at $7.25 an hour.
Sure. Well, that's like it at True Chat. I don't think we have anybody, Lance, that is paid less than $25 an hour. So, I mean, it's kind of, that's the point there, is sometimes to find the people that you need. Companies, capitalism is taking its course there, right? And saying, look, you're not going to find these people for this money. So you gotta pay better. But to Lance's point, we don't want to be in a country, we shouldn't be in a country where if somebody is truly putting in 40 hours a week at a job and they can't make it, that's a sad state of affairs. And none of us should be okay with that. None of us should think that's the type of nation that we should live in.
But be careful there, folks. Don't flood our inbox with applications. We don't have anybody close to $40 working. Don't flood our inbox with applications because our people do not work 40 hours a week. Nobody that I know of besides Justin and myself even work 40 hours a month. So when we say we're paying them, that's what we pay for the work that we hire out. But we don't have that much work that we hire out. We're doing most of it ourselves, and we're not getting paid.
Lance like, wait a minute. I don't make that. Hold on here. What we're talking about. So
I just didn't want us to get inundated with a bunch of job applications. Saying,
right,
hey,
people are going to send us emails.
I'll move to Urbana, Ohio and work for True Chat. They're going to pay me $25 an hour. I'm there tomorrow. It's like, yeah, we don't have full-time work available, folks.
Yeah, before anybody gets too excited.
$25 an hour. If you want to work for free for 40 hours a week, we will take you in a heartbeat. We got
lots of full-time work.
Plenty of things for you to do.
Yes. So, but if you have a comment, what do you think about the minimum wage, the living wage, right? What do you think it should be? What do you think about the plan so far? How do you feel about the stimulus checks? We'd like to know. Email podcast@thestateofus.org, podcast@thestateofus.org. What else is in Biden's stimulus plan? Lance or I, are we a thumbs up or thumbs down? Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
$1,400 checks and a $15 an hour minimum wage. Those are some of the cornerstones of the Biden economic plan. And you've heard from Lance and I think there's some things there that we think are good, but also some things that we definitely would do differently if it was up to us. And that's how it is a lot of times when we talk about this stuff. There's a number of other things in the package. Part of the reason that we save some of these till last is because they require a little less discussion from us. I think they're things that we are generally feel like are positives. So they don't come with quite as many caveats. And the first one there, Lance, states and localities could get $440 billion in help, according to the Biden administration. And the relief plan would entail billions in grants and loans for small businesses and $350 billion in emergency funding for state, local, and territorial governments. We know local governments and states are hurting. It makes sense that we have to address it because unlike the federal government, states don't run deficits. They don't deficit spend. They can borrow money, but they can't have unbalanced budgets, and they could use some assistance from the federal government. What else we have?
I'm going to take two of the points, schools and parent help. President Biden said it's necessary to invest to meet the goal of safely reopening a majority of kindergarten to 8th grade schools within the first 100 days. In doing so, about $130 billion would go towards helping that reopening take place, along with additional state and local funds. And the other $40 billion, the balance would go to helping colleges to deal with the shift in distance learning and other pandemic problems that they have. As far as help for parents, that would come in the form of a tax credit, making them refundable, meaning people would get cash even if they don't earn enough to owe income taxes. Under the expanded child care tax credit, families with children up to the age of 13 could receive a total of up to $4,000 for one child and $8,000 total for two or more children. Families making less than $125,000 per year would receive full credit, while those earning up to $400,000 would receive a partial credit. Obviously, if you're making more than $400,000 as a family, you would not be eligible under the plan. So again, there's something for parents to help them with their children, and then schools. So those kind of tie together. And that's probably most of us would agree that's good to get the children back in school, especially the K-8 children.
I know I said these are quicker because less caveats. I would just add one thing, folks, go back and listen. We've got, The State of Us is a podcast and a syndicated radio program, thestateofus.org. You've got our back catalog of episodes. Go back and listen to when Lance and I have talked about taxes, because I think under the current system, it makes sense to do what's being proposed here, the child tax credit situation. But Lance and I are both on the record as saying there's a better path forward with taxes, and it involves making them less confusing and simpler for everybody. And so again, the caveat of within the current system, I'm okay with it, but I think I would prefer to change the system rather than trying to make a system that I don't think's working the way that we want it to. You're never going to band-aid it enough to fix it. You know what I mean? So it makes it better, but it's never going to be great, I guess is the caveat there. And then the last couple things here, Lance, and these are important for folks. Public health measures at the forefront. Mr. Biden's asking for $160 billion in funding for a national vaccine program to extend testing, a public health jobs program, and other steps meant to fight the virus. Hopefully this is common sense. As we talked about, we're seeing here as the rollout has begun that some further federal coordination is necessary in countries where they have better federal coordination. We're seeing it be more effective at distribution. It seems to make sense. I know it sounds like a lot of money, but again, I think relative to the total expenditure, this is one of those things where I might even be apt to put more money toward this and take money away from maybe one of these other things if it came down to it, because I think that is so important. You want to be done with this, we have to be effective at fighting it.
Well, exactly. I mean, the pandemic is not only a health crisis, it's the economic crisis. The economy will not get better until we take care of the health care. And so we need to get the shots in people's arms that are willing to get it. We're not going to talk today about whether or not you want the shot or you think it's good. But right now,
we have an episode on that.
Right. We do have one that you can listen to. But the people who, like you and me, who want it, we can't even get it yet. And so we need to do something to speed it up so that the people that want it can get the shots sooner rather than later.
Well, and to further your point even more, right? even some people that want it and are eligible for it aren't getting it. So
that's true too. Exactly. That's a better point. Yeah.
Not even the people like you and I that want it but aren't yet eligible. It's also the people that are eligible that want it that haven't gotten it because lots of reasons. The one thing that I think is a positive in all of this, the light and the dark kind of thing, is it's not a lack of available doses at the moment. It's a lack of effective distribution channels.
Right.
And that was something everybody was worried about, and so it is good that from the production standpoint, there isn't an issue at the moment. But it's bad that even though the production's there, we're not delivering on getting them administered the way that we'd like to. So, and then the last point that we need to mention is, the plan to expand paid leave. Mr. Biden would renew paid leave provisions that were not extended as part of the December package. The plan would allow for 14 weeks of paid sick and family and medical leave for caregivers dealing with closed schools or care centers, while providing for a $1,400 leave benefit for eligible workers. This is, I think, again, one of those, it was in the original package. So if you're out there and, you voted for Trump and you voted for the Republicans and rah, right? And I'm not saying that's what everybody does, but we all do this. We all say, when our team does it, it's a good thing. And then when the other team does it, it's a bad thing. Quit that. This is the same thing that already existed last year, that Republicans, yes, Democrats in Congress made it possible, but a Republican Senate and Republican president are the ones that put it in place. So don't you dare change it now. Just because somebody else is pushing it through. So I think it's just important people keep that in mind, Lance. A lot of these things that Biden is proposing are really just expansions of things that have already been happening. Some of them are new, like we talked about. The minimum wage thing obviously is new. But a lot of this stuff is, in some form or fashion, it already was part of the plan. It's just being extended out because we're not done with this crisis.
Yep. And we really appreciate you listening to the show, and what we've done and what we always do here at True Chat is to follow our mission statement, and that is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we appreciate you being a part of that today, and hope that you share these ideas and have that conversation with the people you work with and the people in your family. And if they say, where are you getting all this information? Well, tell them, I'm listening to The State of Us. And they say, well, where can I listen to it? And you tell them that as a podcast, they can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere podcasts are found.
We'd love to hear from you about today's show. You can email us, podcast@thestateofus.org, podcast@thestateofus.org. Send us an email with your comments, questions. We read every one of them that comes in. We may not always reply to each one, but you might even make it on air, depending on how pertinent we think it is to share your comment with the world. So please reach out. We love hearing from you. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our editing producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.